Hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software, and I am pleased to present Sarah Mitchell, our Head of Documentation. Today, Sarah will be giving you a demo of some stuff in Alpha Anywhere, but she is also here, in fact, we're both here to answer your questions. And you could type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's get started. Hello, Sarah, are you there?
I am.
Excellent. I think you're
All
already
right.
the presenter, and in fact, I can see your screen.
Yep, and I assume you can see my mouse.
I can see your
Maybe.
mouse as well.
Can you?
So
Okay. All
you're on
right.
the right screen. Mhm.
I'm learning how to use the pause tool. All right. Yeah. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the demo and Q&A today. Before we get started, just a reminder, DevCon is coming up fast. It's in 2 weeks. If you haven't signed up yet, I very much encourage it. From October 5th to 8th, we will be having some amazing presentations and opportunities to talk with Dev one-on-one and all sorts of stuff. So go to www.alphasoftware.com/devcon2021 to register if you haven't already. And if you have my undying gratitude. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Also, as a sort of a housekeeping note today, and this is just a schedule for the next couple of weeks. Today we're going to do a basic intro on security. But we will not have a webinar next week, nor the week of DevCon, because we will be running DevCon that week. We will not be able to have a webinar. But I do encourage everyone to register if you haven't. Next week, if you are looking for something to watch, highly encourage you to go check out our YouTube library and watch a past broadcast or check out some of the latest feature releases. And then when we come back, we will continue our security discussion. We'll look at publishing and managing users in production.
Cool.
So with that, today, we're going to take an introduction at the security framework in Alpha Anywhere. And this is a popular topic, in part because we've done a lot of new things recently to add some new components for the security framework, as well as just sort of reevaluating the materials we've got and getting them up to speed with the current framework. So to give a rundown of what the security framework is, it's a framework that uses a login, and the application server then validates those access credentials that a user has in the system before serving them a request. And the request can be a web page, it could be a component, individual controls in a component, fields from a table. And the framework has 3 types of access categories across the board: always allowed, requires login, which then determines the access for a user based on the groups they're in, and then always denied. And just as a special note, always denied is the default for any pages and components reports. And that's because we want you to explicitly, consciously make a decision as to who can access something if you have enabled the security framework in your application. The security framework has a variety of features, your basic one being able to create users, giving them roles, a login and a logout, account locking if you want to lock a specific username so it can't be used to log in. That's a feature. We have password rules, expirations for passwords, where you can create restrictions, like a password has to have symbols, numbers, no spaces, and has to be a minimum length but not a maximum length, because that's what password rules are. We have a mechanism for resetting your password if you forgot it. We also include the ability to restrict access not only to pages but to individual components, controls within those components, or even fields within a table. And I believe the specific case for that would be in a list. And if we have time, we might go dig out where that's at. In addition to those features, those basic features, we have support for 2-factor authentication, persistent login, where the user logs in and their login is valid on that system for a period of time that exceeds their session. We have alternative login, which lets you use security credentials from other frameworks to validate that the user has access to your system. We have something called the extended user information table, which is linked to a user's account in the security framework, where you can store additional information, like maybe their 2-factor authentication preferences, or like a home address or a phone number, anything that you want to store in addition to the basic security information, which is really just consists of their username and password and an email address. And we also have server-side API, it's XBasic for interacting with the framework, for doing things like logging a user in or out with XBasic, or checking their groups that they're in to validate if they have access to something on the server side. So the basic setup of your security framework when you've enabled it is you have two things. You have users and you have groups. So users is an account with a username and a password. The username can be anything. It doesn't have to be an email address. Historically and consistently, we always demonstrate using an email address as the username, but you don't have to do that. And then those users are assigned into groups or roles. If you're using IIS, we use the term roles. Same with Alpha Cloud. But users are put into these groups, and then the access within Alpha Anywhere is based on their group, whether or not they're in a group to access something. And all of these roles are defined in the development environment when you create them. The permissions specifying which role they can access, those happen during development time before you publish. Now we have a number of templates in the UX component that help get you started with creating things like a login or an interface for creating an account, and or also managing users and groups. We'll take a look at a very basic login template today during the demonstration. But in addition to these templates, we also have something called a login component, and specifically the login UX, which was added recently. And that login UX serves as a replacement for our old login component, which has been around since, I believe, the dawn of time. And it uses an older model for rendering the controls. But with the UX, you have access to everything you did before in terms of your app development. Plus, it has all these built-in features into it. It has the login, the logout, registering for a new account, resetting your password, which is handled by sending the person an email. It supports persistent login. It has support for two-factor authentication if you want that, and it also has support for collecting extended user information when someone registers. So today we're going to do a live demo of going from nothing and getting an basic app built with security framework enabled with a few logins, and just to show you how you would set all that up. So we are now going to go to Alpha Anywhere. Let's see here. Escape there and come up here. So here I have an empty workspace. There's nothing in it. It's brand new. I haven't put anything in it yet. Let's go look at all files. So you can see there's nothing in here. This is on the current nightly build, and it's also the community edition. So everything that you see here will work for everyone. But with this demo, we're going to create a UX component that has integrated login, set up the security framework, and then do a live test and look at that working locally. So first we're going to do is we're going to start with a UX template. So I'm going to pick web components here and click on new, go to web component, click next, select UX, next. And then down in here, we have a whole bunch of templates. And if you get down to the bottom, there's a bunch that say like security framework. And the one I'm looking for is this login component mobile app. Now it says mobile app, but this would work fine for a web application. It's just designed with the idea of you possibly building a mobile app first, but it works fine with web as well. So we're going to take this one. I'm going to click OK. And then Alpha Anywhere is going to show me this little help, which is a description of what this is. It's a sample login component for a mobile application. We'll close that. And then this is what gets generated. If we preview it now, we'll just see we'll see a user ID, a password, and a login button in the mobile simulator. If we turn that off, it'll span the whole page. And this is telling me that I'm using CSS icons, and I'm ignoring that. So there's a username, user ID, password, login button. So at this point, this won't do anything because we haven't enabled the security framework, but it does give us a starting point for enabling the security framework, which can be a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, and I'll explain why in a moment. So first, we're going to save this. We're going to call it our main app. And we're also going to save a page for this component so that we can publish it and view it in the browser. And I'll click Save Page, and I'm going to call it Main App. So that initial setup is done. We have a very basic app that doesn't do anything other than log in, log out. So next we need to configure the security framework, and that happens on the Web Projects Control Panel. So on the Web Projects Control Panel, there's a button up here. It says Web Security. This is where you go to configure the security framework. And when you click on this button, you'll be presented with several options. And the one we're going to look at right now is security configuration. So I'll click that and click OK. And this opens up the security setup dialog. And right now, security is not active, so I'm going to enable that, which turns on the security framework for the application. So at this point, Alpha Anywhere will start validating credentials, making sure that you have permissions to access something before it gives you back anything from the server. So there, we can look at a few things here. There's a bunch of settings for like redirect pages. What happens when you're login? Like, do you send them somewhere? What page should we show if they don't have permissions to view something that they're trying to access is insufficient permissions? There are a few login options. When should your login expire? We recommend when the current session expires, which is the default. Whether or not there should be a lockout if somebody fails to enter their password correctly a number of times, should they be locked out? Some additional redirect options. Over here in user ID and password options, there's some settings for your user ID configuration. Is it an email address? And then there's some error message on validation if you want to use an email address. And then down here in password options, this is an important thing to remember. There's this thing called password encryption, and it only applies to the classic server. And Community Edition and in general, everybody's publishing to IIS or Alpha Cloud right now, so this doesn't apply at all. So you'll want to turn that off. Other than that, the rest of the settings in here are fine. There is some options for allow user ID recovery. We'll get to that later. I was formulating a thought on that and lost it. But you know, what happens if they lose their ID? Should they be allowed to get their password back? Not recommended. And in fact, you can't even retrieve the password from the security framework because of how we encrypt it. So if you wanted to figure out how that gets set, you can set those things up here. And then there's additional customizations here. This is how long should your security settings be cached on the server before they get reset. That's important to note. You don't really want that to be set very high, especially if you need to update your security because you've added a new group or something down the road that you need to get in your app. You want to make sure this stays relatively short. So I would keep the default. There's also a few settings in here for like custom messages of when someone's entering their user ID and so on and so forth. So those are the basic options in here. We're just gonna enable security, turn off password encryption. We're gonna click OK. We're gonna get a message that none of our redirect pages were set. And because this whole app is going to be contained within a single UX component, we don't need to set any of those redirect pages because there's only going to be one page in this whole app. So what we're going to do is we're going to just set all the pages to a temporary redirect page, which is a placeholder. So we'll click that, click OK. And if you see in here now, temporary redirect page has been entered for all these places where you could specify a page to send the user to if that action happens, like if they don't have permissions to view something, but we're just going to take this. We're not going to set those pages up today. And then we'll click OK, and we're done with turning on the security framework. So do I have any questions about that just now?
Not specifically about that. There was one
Okay.
quick question about security, which says, can the extended user info, can that be a SQL view?
No, it's a table.
It needs to be a table. Yep.
It's a table. Anyway,
Okay.
so
Thanks.
setting up our security, we've created our login component and a page that you can view that login component on. we've enabled the security framework. We turned off the password encryption because we do not need it. And we set temporary pages for all the redirect pages because we also do not need that. So the next step is to create some users and groups so we can test our app with security enabled. So that's done here using users and groups. We'll click OK, and this will open up a dialog where you can add them. Now, these will all be stored locally in the development environment. And later down the road, when you're done developing your app and you're ready to push it up on a server somewhere for the first time, the things you define in here will be published up with your application because your application needs to start somewhere. Once that's happened, you don't really ever want to do that specifically again. Now, you might add groups down the line that you need to add up into your application on the web, and there are ways to publish and merge those in. But it goes one way. So all the security settings set up here are what you use to work with to configure your application, then you publish them up to the server. You can add components to do management of users on the web. Something you never want to do though is create a group up on your website and then attempt to try to get it back into here because that's not easy to do. So first we're going to create a user, call it Sarah at example.com. And for today's demo, everyone's password will be password. Click OK. And we'll add another user. That's Scott. Click OK. So we have two users. And over here, we have a groups thing. When you select a user, you can actually check here to add them to that group. So if you toggle between them, you see how it changes. You always have administrators when you turn the security framework on. It's a default group we create. Beyond that, you have to make your own groups. So that's done over on groups. And here it's quite easy. A group is just a name. You can make one called like user, maybe manager. And these are your groups. Over here, you see your users. You'll see that these have a checkbox next to them. If you check a user while a group is selected, it puts them in that group. So you can see how that changes. So you can manage them in both places here in terms of assigning the groups. But that's the basic setup for adding groups. We'll come back here. We'll put everyone in user, but we'll only make Scott a manager. I'll click OK. And so now I've got 2 users, 3 groups, ready to go to start doing some app development. So that's users and groups. The final thing you need to do, and it's sometimes something people forget, is assign the security settings for your components and your pages. And I mentioned earlier that by default, we put everything to always denied. So what you need to do is change that. And one place to change it is here in page security. So if we select page security and click OK, it's going to show us all the web pages in our application that have security settings that we can change. And you can see here we have main app right now, and it's got a little stop sign symbol with an X on it next to it. And that means that no one can access this page, that you will be rejected every time. We don't want that. This is our login page. So we need to change this to say always allowed so that you can always access our login page. So we'll change that. We'll click close. That'll save things. The other thing we need to change is our component. And go back in here. Pages and all files. I don't see our component in here. Let's click OK. Let's click close out of this and go look at our component. This is all our files. So here's our component. Here's another place where you can set security. If you right click on your files, down here there's a page security option. And our component is also configured to always denied. We want that to be allowed because it's our login component. So we have our page and our component configured to allow access so that someone can log into our application. So let's put it all together and do a live test now and see that in action. So I'm going to click live test. I'm going to pick the development server. I'm going to clear out my test folder before publish just in case there's something else in there. Click OK. and you couldn't see it open because it opened off screen, and I'll make that a little bit narrower, but here is our main app.a5w with our login component on it. So if we enter in our login credentials and click login, it will navigate to the next panel card. So this template was configured so that if there was a successful login, it would take you to the panel application card, which is what's being shown here. If we click log out, it will take us back to the login page. If we enter our credentials wrong, we'll get an error that our login information was not correct because Dave is not a user in our system, so he doesn't have access to our app. So that's the basic from ground zero if you're starting with nothing. You can use this exact same process I just showed here to get set up with your existing files. Keep in mind that you'll have to go through and make sure to configure all your security settings for your existing files to allow access to them as desired. Next thing I wanted to show is just how you can assign security to controls. So let's add a bunch of labels. So we'll call this admin label, manager label, and user label. And I probably do not want to space in their names. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 3 label controls, which are just a data control that displays a value but doesn't have any editing on it that the user can interact with directly. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a security group to each one. I'm going to assign admin to the admin label, manager to the manager label, and users to user label. So click OK, and this will create 3 new controls for me. There's our admin, our manager, and our user. And I'm going to start with admin. I'm going to go over here on the right-hand side. I'm going to scroll down until I find the security section, which is right here. And there's a setting called security groups. And if you open this up, you can specify which groups have access to the control. Now, if you don't select anything, everyone can access it. We want administrators to be the only group to see this particular label. So I'm going to select administrators and then click OK. I'm going to repeat this for manager. I'll pick manager, select manager, click OK. And then user, I'm going to select that. I'm going to check user and click OK. Now, an important thing to note is that when you assign a security group to something, the computation to determine whether someone has access to it happens on the server. So if they are allowed to access the control via the settings here, the component or the control will be generated and included in the layout when it's sent to the client. If they're not allowed to access it, we don't generate it at all. So we'll save this. We'll go back to the Web Projects Control panel and do another live test with our main app. And I like to clear everything out always, just to make sure. So here's our next test. So let's log in with Sarah. And if you remember, Sarah was an admin and a user, but not a manager. So I don't have access to that manager label. If we log out and log in as Scott, we'll see a different interface because he was a manager, but not an admin. So that's a way you can use security to restrict who can see what in terms of controls. Log out and go back to there. In addition to controls here, you could do components. If you want to put your whole app in a separate UX and embed it here and restrict which UX is served up based on the security group, it's really easy to do that if you keep them separate. I also mentioned that you can do field level control. So let's quickly pull up a list. We'll create a new list. We'll click OK. We'll double click it. Let's give it some SQL data. Oop, that is not SQL data. That's arguments. We'll pick our Northwind. And let's do products, because we do customers all the time, but never products. Select all, click OK. And I believe it's this setting here. Let's take a quick peek. Here we go. So in the list, if you have a SQL-based query, there's a setting called security and show hide expressions, which lets you configure security access to those columns so that, let's say, let's set a security group on here. Let's say only administrators are allowed to know what our products are called, but everyone else can only see the product ID, which is a bit of a contrived example, but I think it will show you what this does. So we'll click OK. So that's configured that product name will only be shown to people who are administrators. So now if we go over to our list layout, let's put product ID, product name, and unit price in there and click OK. Let's save this and live test it again. We'll take a look at it from the admin's point of view and then from the manager's point of view who doesn't have access. So we'll click live test. Open up another tab in my browser. Pull it across here, and we'll log in with Sarah. Oops. And log in. And so you see, I see 3 columns here: product ID, product name, which is not rendering the product name for some reason, and unit price. Click log out. Log in with Scott. So it's the same view. I'll look into that. I apologize. But that's supposed to filter out which one you see. Let's go back and double check just to make sure we didn't miss something. So that's security. I'll have to investigate that a bit deeper for next time. But that's my whole demo. Were there any questions?
Yeah, we do have a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start right up at the beginning. One is, well, yeah, here's a good one.
Oh, here we
Where
go.
is the security information actually stored? Because some of it obviously you're setting it up right here in the development IDE, but at some point, of course, it's going to get pushed up to the server, so the server knows what pages are allowed
Mm-hmm.
and what users can access things. And can you talk a little bit about where the data lives?
So the data lives in IIS and on Alpha Cloud in particular. It lives in a very specific data store. And
Mm-hmm.
give me a moment, I can look up the word for that.
The web application, is that what it's called, or something like that? Right, security application.
Well, so the term for when you're configuring your security users and roles and stuff like that, publishing, and if you wanted to back up and restore, that's called a security application.
Mm-hmm.
Because Alpha Cloud also has security for other reasons around who can access your account.
Right.
But all of that stuff is put up in a special data repository that you actually can't access.
Right.
So on the classic server, you would store your security stuff in a database. But under
All right.
IIS and Alpha Cloud, it gets stored in a different location. And that's just to keep it secure so people can't access it directly.
Oh, okay.
I believe it's, I can't remember the term that we used for it.
That's fine. But it's a type of database, but it's a database
Mm-hmm.
that's hidden from the user and you don't have direct
Yeah,
access
you
to
don't
the
have
data.
access to it, no. So anybody that's built apps in the past who has had the convenience of being able to do like a direct SQL query on their users and groups, which we do not recommend. We recommend using the XBasic API instead. They can't do that on Alpha Cloud. You'd have to use the context security object, and we can take a quick look at that briefly real quick here. Because context security allows you to do a bunch of things. It has a ton of methods for doing things like adding a user to a role, or removing a user from a role, or regenerating their password as an admin, setting up their security questions, getting information about the currently logged in user, finding out if they're in a role, whether or not their password is expired. It has the login and the logout methods in it. And it also has stuff in it for like locking the user account, so they literally cannot log in with that name.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another question. You've given a demonstration of how to set it up so that certain users can see certain fields. But how would you set it up so that certain users could only see certain records? For example, an admin could see all the records in the table, but a particular user would only be able to see the records that pertain to them, maybe have their user ID in it or something like that.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So if you like a database where the records are assigned to a specific user. So the way you would do that is you would add a query in your we'll open this up for the list here. Let's switch this over to custom SQL statement. So here, like say you had a user ID field in here, you wouldn't necessarily need to pull it down, but you would just add like a where clause. So we go over to filter and we'd say like user ID is equal to a value or an expression. And then here is where you could put an argument that's populated with the user's ID. And let's take a look at that. When someone logs into the security framework, let's see here. Their username gets stored in a variable in the context security object called current user. And you could read that username from that variable, or that variable, and then use that as your key. So you would read that out of the context security current user. You do want to make sure that that was a successful call. If the user session were to time out, the current user might not exist anymore, so that would log them out automatically. So after checking that if it was successful or not, you would then put that into a session variable, which you could then reference in an argument. And in the list, arguments are set in this arguments property here, and you would just create a new one. You would be a character type. You would call it like user ID or something like that, or customer, or however you wanted to define it. And you could say, oh, you can actually just say get the value from the current logged in user. Convenience. All right. So that's the easy way. So that'll be populated with the logged in user, and then you could filter your database on that, assuming that the user ID that they log in with is the one you've keyed on. If you haven't, then you need to get that value from somewhere and put it in a session variable that you could reference here.
So that covers showing the data that only belongs to that one particular user. If you were an admin and you wanted to see all of the records, what I've seen in the past, and maybe this is a good solution, is to have another screen basically that's an admin only screen that's meant for searching everything. And then you can by users and things like that. So,
yeah, because that might be the best way to handle it.
In other words, make an admin interface and then restrict that admin interface just to admins kind of thing.
Yeah, that would be a really good way of approaching it, because then you've disconnected completely what your user sees from what your administrators have access to, which is the safest option. Because if you come in here and accidentally the whole thing, you might expose all of your admin stuff to your users.
Interesting.
Yeah, like if you delete the variable comparison or something.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's see what else we've got here.
We also have, it's a bit higher level, but in the connection strings, you can actually set up something that's called a multi-tenant connection string. Let's build that real quick. Multi-tenant, click OK. And what this does is it filters your database calls through this connection string. So the connection string in this properties is actually like the database you're going against, like say Northwind. And then the tenant ID would be that user ID field, right? Which you could assign to the user when they log in. So then if you used this connection string, it would automatically apply that filtering to the current user, and you wouldn't have to set up all those arguments in the list to do that.
So that's sort of a dummy-proof way, because you know if you're going to use that particular SQL connection string, then you know you
Yeah.
can't mess it up. It's only going to work if it's been given a user ID. It's not going to
Yeah.
spill all the rest of the data if it doesn't have one. Oh, good. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
if you took it a step further, you could get into the whole dynamic connection strings thing where you pick a connection string when they log in, and that's the one you use, but that gets
Awesome.
complicated.
So I want to go back to something that you had said, I don't know, about 10, 15 minutes ago, and it had just to do with the users and groups. You said they should only be published once. What do you
Your
mean by that?
core ones, yeah. So
Okay.
the first time you publish, you're going to publish up your users and groups. If you put a production application out there and you've provided a mechanism for people to register and stuff like that, if you do a publish again and you overwrite that database, you will delete all those logins because it copies from your development environment up. So instead of doing that, you want to do something which is I think it's called merge, where you merge all the stuff that's in your environment up into the system that's on the web.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in other words, you don't want to replace. So there is a version of here which is being stored in the IDE because you're not necessarily connected to the
And
cloud.
in Community Edition, it's actually these 4 files right here. They're called DBF tables. If you're running the full version, you can kind of pick what your development environment uses for security storage, but because we only let you publish to Alpha Cloud, we just picked DBF for you, so you don't have to worry about that, because the Alpha Cloud stores security credentials separately from your application and your
But
database.
in any event, there is some sort of local copy, right? And so if you make changes to that local copy and push them live, you could be overwriting stuff that's happened up
Yeah,
on the
if you
server.
overwrite them, yeah.
So the idea is that you publish these once just while you're setting them up, just so that you have a couple users. Maybe you just put the admin in, and
Yeah.
then then you have pages that are in your application that are meant to work with those users and groups, right? Okay, yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And there's a page on managing security. And when you publish your users and roles, we provide a whole bunch of options. We can preserve, only publish them if
Oh,
they
I
don't
see. So
exist,
you could
or
update
don't
it.
publish them at all,
Yeah,
merge your new ones, replace the ones that are up there, only merge your roles or replace all your roles.
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I'll put that in
So
the
in that
chat.
case, it would be okay to publish those a couple of times as long as you made
Yeah,
sure
it
that
would. Just
option was
be aware when you're publishing,
right.
where to go. Like if you do a replace, which you have to, I believe you have to actively choose that, but it will override everything.
Okay. Yeah. Very cool. Excellent. So, here's the question. Users and groups, this whole security framework, does this apply on the workspace level or does it apply on the project level?
The project,
Excellent.
I believe.
So you can have
Well, it's
multiple,
going to be
well,
the
yeah, you
project and
have to.
community edition because you don't have desktop, which would be workspace stuff.
Okay. But as you create, okay, yep, as you create new web projects, they can have different security
Yeah,
settings from each
yeah.
other.
In fact, this web project is in a workspace that has a whole bunch, and the security in my security test is not the same as security setup, which we just created.
Right, got it. Let's see what other questions we've got out here today. This one is a little bit involved, so we'll probably get to it offline, but I'd like to sort of read it out anyway, which is that this person, their internet went out while they were running an API multiple times last night, and that put their app into an event handler, but they were wondering, is there a way to restart just the last line that is executed in your API when an internet connection is restored. It's kind of an
Oh,
interesting fallback. Not something we can handle right here, but I
mm,
think something we could probably think about. You'd have to obviously have awareness that the internet connection has been restored and where you were.
yeah.
That's a good one. Yeah,
I
can you
think,
send us that one to guides, GUIDES at alphasoftware.com, and we can take a look at that. That's an interesting question.
yeah, I think on that one you would just want to rerun your whatever the process was that failed, and hopefully you have some sort of transactioning that prevents you from
That can
duplicating
handle it when you
data,
run the
that
same
type of
thing.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I gotcha. Um, oh, someone else said, well, why not? So you showed one way today of creating a login. What
hmm
about just using the login component, like just say new login component?
You could
Is
do
that
that.
recommended? Okay.
Yeah, in fact, the login component, if you do new login, will actually generate the new um, login UX for Community Edition, which has two views, image on left or image behind your login props.
Uh-huh.
I'll click and save.
And this is new as of, oh, I don't know, a month or so ago that it does this as opposed to
June,
creating,
July.
oh,
Yeah,
okay, a
so this
couple
is
months. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's quite new and it's got a lot in it. So
Yeah.
we did the simple demonstration today, which has things in it we didn't talk about, which is two-factor authentication.
Uh-huh.
Because this guy is huge. It's got a lot of stuff in it. It's got
Okay.
creating new accounts, storing extended user information, storing your two-factor authentication settings with your extended user information, um, getting a new password, resetting your password, going through the whole forgot password or create account, turning these things on and off. Uh, and then what happens after you log in? Do we go to your panel card application, which is provided, or does it redirect to another page? And all of these things are configured through properties over here down in the login section of the UX. And using integrated login functionality, you now have access to all of this stuff. So
Mhm.
this is going to be like a one or two two presentations worth to
Okay. Yep.
cover, because we want to talk about things
There's
like
an awful lot of
persistent login
information there.
and
Mhm.
two-factor authentication and that kind of thing. So
Terrific.
we're just getting sort of a basic intro of how to get started up and running with some basic login. And then we'll take a look at how do you manage your users and groups online and so on and so forth.
So here's another question. If you have set up a login page with a login window, is there a way to set it up so that when the page loads, the focus is brought immediately to the user ID field so people don't have to
Yeah,
click
I
around?
think we added, at least in the UX, I think we added
Okay.
a focus property somewhere.
Initial focus.
Initial
Okay.
focus, find property. There it is. So if we check that, the user ID field should have focus when the dialog is first shown. And we'll just do a working preview real quick.
Great.
So you can see that's giving it focus. And that's gonna be any UX. You can do that in any UX.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's see what else we've got. Sort of an interesting question, and it has to do with using Alpha Anywhere to explore a data structure. Like, do we have imagine that we had some information that was more hierarchical type of data. What types of controls does Alpha have for handling that kind of thing? I believe we have a tree control. I mean, it would be maybe a fair amount of work if you wanted to use it as a database, your own database explorer. Um, but for hierarchical data in a UX, I think the tree is probably the best
Is this just wanting to provide an interface for exploring a database?
for exploring. Yeah.
Oh, does it have to be mobile?
I don't know if it has to be mobile. Maybe not.
Because if it doesn't have to be mobile, you could just run it through the Flying Start Genie to generate a bunch of tables or a bunch of
Oh, I
grids.
see. Oh, just have it build it out for you. That's a
Yeah,
way of exploring it
that's
because
one
we
way to
have
do it.
access to one of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that would give you an entire interface for exploring things. It doesn't have to
Sure.
be editable. You could turn off all the editing, and
Hmm.
the
Okay.
list has settings for adding and removing columns from a data source, which you could configure, but you have to set that up in advance. We also have, let's go new web component UX. What did we call it? We have an example that shows building database queries on a list.
So the person who sent this in, if you want to just send an email off to guides. In
There it
fact,
is.
everyone should know that
UX
you
ad
can send
hoc
emails
SQL
to
query builder.
guides@alphasoftware.com, and we'll take a look at that in more detail.
So cancel. No connection. Load, save, close. We have this thing called the ad hoc SQL query builder that's a template. And I'm just going to live preview it real quick here to see what it does. This might do what you want. So I
Maybe. I
have
think
not
they're more
specified
interested
connection
in,
strings.
yeah.
Let's do that. So we'll come down here to connection strings and we'll add one. I think we just do Northwind. And then tables. Customers and products. Let's see what this does. I think this does what they want. The Northwind. Oh, look, there's all of our tables. Employees and execute. Whoops.
Oh, that worked actually.
Yeah, so there's my, hold on. Why is this collapsing things? Results. Oh no, that is showing me it. So there's our first name, last name, title, title courtesy of, etc., etc. And then this giant thing over here that is a base64 encoded image field. But I think this does what they want as well. And if we'll go back in here, we'll go new UX. I'll search for add, and it's down here, this UX ad hoc.
UX ad
query
hoc
builder.
SQL query builder. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
so that might give you more freedom because all you have to do is give it a connection string and it'll give you a list of all the tables in it.
Okay. Yeah, that might be what they're looking for. It looks like it might be a little different. Anyway, they'll send an email to guides and we'll look at it in more detail. Next up, we've got just back to the user ID password thing. Okay, what if the user ID already is filled in when you get there because it remembered you or something? How do you set the how do you change the focus so that it goes then to the password field?
I don't know. I have to investigate that a bit.
We'll
You would
investigate that
need
one.
to you would need to do something probably in the client side on probably on initialize complete or one of these client side events to check to see if there was a value in the username, and if there was, then to call the set focus method on the password. And I think we have one. If we go to insert method, I think we have, yeah, we have this method here called set focus.
Okay, so we have built-in
Yeah, and you
commands
just give it the control name that you
that
want to
can
set the
change the
focus to.
focus based on logic. Okay, great.
Yeah, but that's going to require JavaScript to do
Of
at
course.
that point.
Yep. Another question, is two-factor authentication available for the Alpha Anywhere Community Edition?
Yes, this is Community Edition.
Terrific.
It is available.
Yep.
To reiterate the restrictions on Community Edition, you don't have access to our desktop building, which is another thing called a control panel. You can't get to it. We don't let you make DBF tables. And there are a few settings that are automatically chosen for you because it doesn't make sense to provide a choice in those situations because you can only work with SQL. And then the final thing is we only let you publish to Alpha Cloud from the interface.
Very cool. And then there was a question of, is there a way to upgrade if you already have an app that's using DBF security tables to get them to use SQL tables?
Yes, there's a way to upgrade that.
Okay,
We have a migration document.
cool.
Sorry, I'm going backwards. DBF. Let's see here. This is using security tables. Here we go. It's using SQL tables and web security. So I think the order of operations is you use the upsize genie on your DBFs to move them to a SQL database, and then you change your SQL setup
Okay,
to
I
use
see.
SQL instead.
Can you put the link to that documentation article in the
I
chat?
can, yeah. So just as a fair warning, it does have a deprecated note on it because it's extremely rare that we run into somebody that wants to migrate from DBF over to SQL. So
But it happens.
it's extremely rare now.
Okay, I know, it's been a long time.
Yeah. But like the security framework will generate all of the SQL tables you need in your data source where you want to store that stuff. If you're going to Alpha Cloud, and I think also IIS, you don't need to migrate them because the security configuration is stored in a different location.
Yeah, and it handles it for you. Yeah,
Yeah, and it handles it for you.
cool.
I think it's called a security provider. I will remember the term eventually.
All right, that looks like it. It looks like we've chunked through our questions. If we did miss any, or if anyone has any additional ones, you can send an email to guides, GUIDES, @alphasoftware.com. Sarah, thanks very much for presenting. And sorry, we're not going to see folks next week, but we are going to see you at the DevCon in 2 weeks, and we look forward to that. We'll return to our Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcasts in about 3 weeks. So until then, or until the DevCon, take care and stay well. Thank you, and goodbye.